Good afternoon and welcome everyone. The National Caucus and Center on Black Aging Incorporated, NCBA, welcomes you to our webinar on Explore the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, Accessibility and Inclusion, which will be presented by the Northwest Americans with Disabilities Act Center. Our presenter today is Katie Warden, JD, PhD, the director of the Northwest ADA Center. Prior to joining the ADA Center, Katie worked as a disability rights attorney in the protection and advocacy system. Thank you so much for joining us today, Katie. We appreciate you. Thank you again. Welcome, everyone. And Katie will now join us and present for us and further introduce herself. Thank you for joining us, Katie. We're so glad to have you. Welcome.
Thank you, Angela. And thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm really excited to talk with you all about this law, the Americans with Disabilities Act. It's a law that helps us create more accessible spaces in our communities, and it prohibits disability discrimination. And it's a law that has benefited me in my life and in my career. So I'm really excited about this topic. In a few more slides, I'm going to say a little bit more about my relationship to disability and disability rights work. And before we start, I just want to say that I love questions, and please feel free to ask questions throughout. I'm going to try my best to stop and pause to look in the chat to see if there are questions there, to ask Angela if she can share questions with me as they come through. So please feel free to ask questions as they come up. So, like Angela said, I work at the Northwest ADA Center. And so on the slide right now, there's a map of the United States, and it's broken into 10 different regions. And these are the different ADA centers that we have. The Northwest ADA Center is Region 10, and so we work in Idaho, Washington, Oregon, and Alaska. But there are ADA centers that work throughout the country. And you can contact your local ADA center and ask questions about this law, about other disability laws, and different kinds of resources and services that exist to help people with disabilities access employment or participate in the community. So on the slide, I've also got our hotline number, and that's 1-800-949-4232. And this is a number that will route your call to your particular ADA center based on your area code. I also have our email address at the Northwest ADA Center up on the slide. So I want to pause and note that as I'm presenting, you might notice that I spend a little extra time describing the images and the content on the slides. And that's an accessibility practice that we do to try and make sure that as many people in the audience can access all of the images and all of the information that we have on slides. So, like I said, we're part of this national network. We have a hotline, and you can call and ask questions about the ADA. So on this slide, I have a link to our national network website. And this will tell you more about which center corresponds to your region. There's also lots of information about the ADA. So what is a service animal? What kind of accommodations can I get at work? We have information like that online. When you call us or any of the ADA centers, it's important to know that it's confidential and it's free. So we are not the ADA police. We don't enforce the ADA. We're just kind of information specialists, and our job is to try and help people understand how this law can benefit them, how it can apply to their lives. So all of the ADA centers, we also provide trainings and conferences. We try and help organizations understand how they can develop policies that'll be more accessible, and how they can change their practices to include people with disabilities as part of the public, but as part of their employment force too. So again, we don't enforce the ADA, but we're a resource to help people understand, how does this law work? What are my rights? And so now on this slide, I have a picture of myself and my grandma. And I want to take a few moments to tell you all about my disability and how I came to this work, and also to talk about my grandma's disability. And I'm doing this intentionally because one of the key things to know about the ADA and to know about disability is that we can all come to disability through many different ways. And so I was born with a disability, and then I developed disabilities as a child also. So I had type 1 diabetes, and I got that as a kid. I also have a learning disability and a couple of different mental health conditions. So I have kind of forms of neurodiversity, and you might hear that word more and more now, that kind of people whose minds work a little bit differently than what's typical. And so I was born kind of with a different mind that works a little bit differently than other kids' minds. And then I became diabetic. And that experience really shaped me as a person and led me to disability rights and to wanting to make sure, well, to try to see if I could help other children with disabilities not experience discrimination and exclusion. And so I've included the picture with my grandma here because my grandma just turned 101 last week. And for the first 96 years of her life, she wasn't a person with a disability. And the last 5 years or so, she's developed some mobility impairments. So she started using a cane, and she now uses a walker. She's also developing dementia. And my grandma would never in a million years identify as a person with a disability, right? She wouldn't say, yeah, I have a disability, I'm a disabled person. That's just not part of her identity. But the conditions she's developed as she's aged, as she's gotten to experience a very long life, are disabilities protected by the Americans with Disabilities Act. And it doesn't really matter how we identify kind of on a personal individual level. We don't need to do that in order to receive protections under this law. So I want to note again that you might be noticing that I go back and forth between saying people with disabilities and disabled people. And that's just kind of common practice in the disability rights movement now, that we go back and forth between either of those two terms. So on this slide, I just have our funding acknowledgement and a legal disclaimer. And so the Northwest ADA Center, like the other ADA centers, were funded by the Administration for Community Living. And although we're talking about a law now, we're going to talk about the Americans with Disabilities Act. The information we're sharing, it's intended as information, and it's not specific, individualized legal advice. All right, so let's start talking about some of the highlights of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Why do we have this law? Who does it protect? And why does it matter? So one reason that we say that the ADA matters is because disability impacts all of us. So on this slide, I have an infographic from the CDC, and it shows that we tend to estimate that about 1 out of 4 people in the United States has a disability. And actually, a lot of disability researchers and disability rights lawyers, we think that's a low estimate, that there are actually even more people with disabilities than 1 out of 4. And when we talk about how the ADA defines disability, who counts as a person with disability, we'll see that this is a really broad group of people with all different kinds of conditions, diseases, ways of communicating, ways of processing information, ways of moving about in the world. And so there's also some clip art people that highlight the diversity of disability, right? You can see some disabilities. People might use assistive technology or mobility devices. They might have prosthetics, and you might not see other disabilities. It's really a diverse group of people. So underlying the Americans with Disabilities Act and other disability rights laws, it's kind of a different way of thinking about disability. It's different from the way I grew up thinking about disability and the way that most of us in the US grow up thinking about disabilities. Typically, we tend to think that disability is something bad. It's a tragedy. It's something we want to avoid. It's a negative part of life. But disability rights activists really have a different perspective on what disability means, what it's like. And we call this a diversity perspective on disability. And so really what we're trying to say is that variation from the typical is natural. So it's a natural and valuable part of the world, of the human experience, that some people move through life walking, that some people move through life rolling. It's a valuable part of the world that some people communicate with American Sign Language, that some people have minds that might work faster or slower. And this is a good and acceptable, normal, something to be celebrated part of what it means to be in the human community. So there's a little image here that's just, there's some marbles, I think, and some of them are, I think they're black marbles and one is red. And so difference is something that's valuable in this perspective of thinking about disability. And that really is an unusual or different way of thinking about this experience, something we don't always see in TV or movies. So on the slide, it also says that everyone has or will eventually experience disability. And that's a common phrase we use in the disability rights movement, that you can be born with a disability. You can develop them as the result of an illness, or the result of an accident, or as part of aging. So it's a group that anyone can join kind of at any time. And because we believe and kind of we see disability as something that isn't a tragedy, it's just part of life, that idea is underlying the Americans with Disabilities Act. And it's why the ADA is a civil rights law, right? It's a law that's saying people with disabilities, they shouldn't experience discrimination. We shouldn't exclude people because they have a disability. And instead, we need to make sure that we change our environments to ensure that people have equal opportunity to employment, to community services, to government work as well, to government programs. And so that's why on this slide, there's an overhead image of a playing field, because the ADA is really about how do we make sure that the way we build our society allows people with disabilities to get on the field, to participate in the game. And that's different from other disability laws that are benefits laws, like Social Security, or some special education laws that provide, they could provide monetary benefits, they can give income, or different kinds of services like counseling or therapies. And that's not what the ADA is. This is about civil rights and protection from discrimination. So disability discrimination, it can look a little bit differently than how in the US we tend to think of discrimination. And so I want to talk about some of the reasons why we have the ADA, and why disability discrimination is addressed in the way it is in the Americans with Disabilities Act. So, of course, discrimination includes things like exclusion, right? That we have a history in this country of not permitting children with disabilities to attend schools. So that's a form of discrimination. We also, of course, have the history, and we still see this, right? Different treatment on the basis of disability, like we would see on the basis of other protected categories, like race, gender, national origin. And so maybe people with disabilities are paid less in the workforce, or women are paid less in the workforce. So different treatment. Those are prohibited forms of discrimination. But on this slide, I've also got some images of random things that can be discrimination for people with disabilities. And so the first image there, it's a staircase. And so sometimes in certain settings, stairs instead of a ramp or an accessible entrance or an elevator or a lift, that can be a form of discrimination. That's kind of like saying, we don't want you here, people with disabilities, and you can't get in the door because we only have steps. And if your body happens to work in a way where you don't walk or you don't climb steps, you can't come in. The next image I have is of some TV screens. And so it's also a form of discrimination. If the government was going to make a public service announcement, right? Like if there was a heat wave or a natural disaster and they didn't include captions or ASL interpretation, that's a form of discrimination under this law. The last image is just of some cubicles and they all look the same. And this to me represents the idea that sometimes we assume that all people function in the same way. Everybody can work in the same cubicle that's the same size, use the same chair, use the same keyboard, the same headphones. And when we assume that everybody's the same and we require everybody to use the same equipment at work, that can be discrimination because people with disabilities sometimes need different technology, like a special keyboard or a different kind of chair or a different kind of computer. And so I'm going to stop share, and Keisha is going to show a video that I think it summarizes this idea that the way we've built the world kind of unintentionally can exclude people with disabilities. Let me stop share.
Imagine a town full of physically impaired people, all wheelchair users. They run everything. There aren't any able-bodied people, so naturally, when they built the town, the community decided it was pointless to have ceilings 10 foot high and doors 7 foot high. So the ceilings were built at 7 foot and the doors at 5 foot. In every way, they designed the place the way they wanted it. One day, a few able-bodied people come to stay. One of the first things they notice is the height of the doors. And the reason they notice is because they keep hitting their heads. They come to stand out by the bruises they carry on their foreheads. Soon doctors, psychiatrists and social workers all become involved. Committees are formed. Many people are worried about what becomes known as the problem of the able-bodied. Throughout the town there is a growth of real concern. Specially toughened helmets are handed out, free to the able-bodied, to be worn at all times. Braces are designed which give support and relief, while keeping the able-bodied wearer bent to normal height. Various groups of compassionate wheelchair users get together and form registered charities. Every quarter they have a collection day. Upturned helmets are left in pubs and shops for people to drop their small change into. There is talk of founding special homes. But then one day, it dawns on the able-bodied that there is nothing actually wrong with them, just that society excludes them.
Thank you, Keisha.
All right, there you go. I'm gonna stop this now, Katie.
Oh, okay. So I hope that was a helpful video for you all. To me, it really highlights that, we may just have built the world in a way where we didn't think about all the different ways that people move, all the different ways that people communicate. And we can change the way we build doors. We can change the way we have captions on TV, right? Those are changes that we make. And that's what the ADA is really about. We say that the ADA it's about changing the environment to fit more people, right? To fit the needs of how different people move and think and communicate. And the environment, it doesn't necessarily just include our built environment, our buildings, our sidewalks, our streets, our elevators. It can also include kind of our expectations or the social norms or kind of the typical ways that we do things. And so on this slide, I have kind of what does the ADA require? It's asking us to change the environment. And so it's asking us to really assume and respect that people have different ways of moving, thinking, and communicating. And because we know this, we're going to build more accessible communities, and we're going to make accommodations to allow more people to participate. And so on the slide, I also have an image of some school desks, some chairs that look like they might be in a classroom somewhere. And that's just to remind myself that I want to tell you all a short story that I think, for me, it really highlighted how it's not just our architecture, but it can also be our assumptions and kind of our expectations about how people are supposed to act that can exclude people with disabilities. And so I had a client who was a 6-year-old boy with autism a few years ago. And his mom was from Colombia. And so I would meet with her regularly, and we were translating papers at her kitchen table and preparing a case to try and keep him included at school. So this little boy, he was 5 or 6, and he would come to the kitchen table and listen to us. He didn't speak at the time. He would listen, and he would always stand on a chair to do that. He wouldn't stand on the ground. He wouldn't sit in the chair. He stood on a chair. And it turns out he was doing that in elementary school too. So when they had reading circle and all the little kids were sat cross-legged on the floor listening to the teacher, he would pull up a chair behind them and stand on it in order to pay attention. And he didn't move around. He didn't make noise or distract anyone. But for some reason at that point in his life, he needed to stand on the chair to focus and to concentrate. And it really upset his teacher. And I remember talking with her and saying, well, what's the impact? Is it disrupting the class? Why is it a problem? And it wasn't a problem in any meaningful way, except that it was kind of weird. And it's not the typical way of doing things. And so sometimes just those little assumptions we make, they can exclude people, and we can make quick changes. Well, it's okay if someone's going to stand while other people sit. It's not disrupting anything. And that's an example of kind of what we can do to change the environment, not just in terms of steps and doorways, but also kind of our assumptions about how to act when we're in a place. Okay, so that's kind of our broad overview of how the ADA works. And now I want to talk about who people with disabilities are under this law. And I hope that we have some time kind of for questions. I think there's already some questions in there about disabilities. So who is a person with a disability under the ADA? Because it's important to know that there are different definitions in special education law. There are different definitions of disability in Social Security. And so the ADA is a civil rights definition of disability. And that means it's really, really broad. It includes a lot of people. And so the definition under the ADA is that someone with a disability, a person with a disability, is someone who has a physical or mental condition that substantially limits a major life activity. And I don't know why they had to write this definition in such a complicated legal way. For me, what this means is that under the ADA, a person with a disability is someone who has a condition, and that might be a medical diagnosis like diabetes or cancer or autism. It might just be something about their body. Maybe they have a limb that's atypical. Maybe they don't have forelimbs. Their body is a little bit different than what's typical in the society. And that condition or that difference that they have, it limits an activity that's part of our daily lives. And so there's some clip art on the screen that's just a person running or walking, right? So a major life activity could be walking, running, moving through space in that way. It could be hearing, it could be seeing, it could be communicating or concentrating. Our major life activities can also be bodily functions. So I've got some clip art of organs there. So maybe in the case of diabetes, for example, right? I have a condition, I've got something different about my pancreas, and it limits my ability to eat, but it also limits my bodily function of processing glucose, right? And processing food. And so it's important to know that this isn't saying you can't do any of those things. It's just you can't do them in the same way that other people do them. They might limit your life in some meaningful way. So this definition also includes people who have a record of a condition like that. And so typically we think of this with people who might be in recovery from substance use disorder. It's also people who are in recovery from cancer, right? They no longer have cancer, but they have a history of that. And sometimes we see that employers might not hire people who have a history of a disability. And so that's a condition or an experience that's protected under the ADA. It also includes people who are just perceived by others to have a disability. So this often applies to people who might have a burn or facial scarring. They might move or act in a way that's kind of understood to be different by other people, but they don't actually have any limitations. The only limitation is that other people assume they can't do something or that they're different. And so people who say, I don't actually have a disability, it's that other people think I do because of a burn or some scarring I have, they're also protected under this law. And so the ADA doesn't really have a list of protected conditions. It goes through this process of, can be anyone who has a condition that limits part of their life. But there are some disabilities that typically, in most cases, are protected conditions, protected disabilities under the ADA. And so I've got a list of these here, and I'll just read a few out because these are things that many people who have these conditions, they don't identify as people with disabilities. They don't know that the ADA applies to them, and that's okay. They don't need to identify that way. The ADA still can protect them. So there's autism, multiple sclerosis, hearing loss, right? Age-related hearing loss can be a disability. Blindness or low vision, traumatic brain injuries, depression, heart disease even can be a disability. Post-traumatic stress disorder, cancer, diabetes, type 1 and type 2, HIV, and ADHD. Those are just examples of different conditions that can be protected as disabilities under this law. So I want to just remind everyone that the ADA applies to a broad group of people who don't identify as disabled. And that complicated legal definition, another way to think about it is, does your body or brain work differently than what's typical or average in the society? And does that difference make it harder for you to do things like hear or see, speak, think, walk, or breathe? Now, it's important to also note that disabilities can be invisible, like type 1 diabetes, or like a learning disability, or a mental health condition, like cancer. Right? There are many invisible disabilities. It's also really, really important, and this is a big part of the ADA, and why there isn't just a list of, if you have these conditions, you're protected, but instead that definition of, do you have a difference in your body that limits the way that you experience an activity every day? And that's because disability looks different for everyone. We are all unique. And so you all might have already heard this saying, right? That if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. And in the disability rights world and in the ADA, we tend to think of kind of each disability as kind of an individual's unique experience. You can't say that, these are the accommodations we give to everyone with autism. These are accommodations for everyone with diabetes, because that disease or condition can impact people in unique ways. And so the ADA is a person by person or case by case law. Yeah, so we got a question in the chat. Just could you speak more to dyslexia as a disability? Yeah, so dyslexia, right, the way it would fit within this definition of disability under the ADA, right, is that we could say that there's a mental condition, right? There's a mental experience, there's something going on in our brains that limits or impacts or even just makes us do things differently when it comes to processing words or communication, right? So it's something in our brains, something in our body that limits or changes the way that we access information, specifically written words, right? Or reading. Does that help answer the question, Angela? Is that kind of, that's how the definition would include dyslexia, that
Yes,
or is that, yeah, or is there
yes,
something
it
else
helps.
like, does it help? Okay.
Okay.
Uh,
And how could you move forward, Katie, or and advocate for a parent with a younger child? Does it need to be diagnosed? How, if you could add a little bit,
yeah.
that would be great.
Yep. Great question. Thank you, Angela. So under the ADA, you don't need medical documentation or official diagnosis, right, to ask for an accommodation, for example, at a summer camp for children or at, I don't know, a sporting group for a kind of sporting activity for kids. But in education, there's actually a different law that applies, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And this is a law that would protect most students with dyslexia and provide kind of specialized instruction to help them learn to read. And it's a different law with a different set of requirements. And in that case, a school might require an official diagnosis either through the school or through an outside provider. And I don't have it in my resource list, but I will, after the presentation, I'll send this to you, Angela. There are centers called Parent Training and Information Centers in each state, and these are run by parents of kids with disabilities. And they are kind of experts in learning and knowing how to advocate for kids with disabilities and asking for specific accommodations at school. And so someone also asked about dementia as a disability. And so again, dementia would be a disability protected under the ADA, right? There's something different about the way a mind works from what's typical. So dementia could impact our major life activities of concentrating, communicating. It could impact our, we call them daily living activities like getting dressed or bathing or eating. Again, if we think about how every diagnosis can really impact people in different ways or look different for different people, I think dementia is a great example of that. That one person with dementia, they might have a very different experience than someone else. Oh, this is such a good question in the chat right now. So is any chronic illness a disability? So the ADA it asks us to think about each person as an individual. In the vast majority of cases, chronic illnesses are disabilities under the ADA. That's not true necessarily for Social Security, and they have a very different definition of disability, or special education laws, different definition of disability. But for the ADA, yes, most chronic illnesses are. But some people, like I have friends with diabetes, and they would say, I'm not a person with a disability because, I take my pill and then I never think about diabetes. It doesn't impact my life in any way. I would argue that technically they're still protected by this law because diabetes affects our endocrine system. But people might say, a particular chronic illness, it doesn't have a big enough effect on our daily life to count as a disability. The example we tend to use there is with allergies, that some people might have allergies that they don't really have a significant enough effect on their daily lives to be a disability, whereas other people, their allergies, yes, they definitely are a disability that limit a major life activity. And so Katie, who asked this question, I apologize because this is one of the frustrating things about the ADA. There's not a lot of absolutes. Well, it depends. It depends if a chronic illness has enough of an effect on our lives to rise to the level of a disability. Great, thank you for all those questions. So I want to highlight some of the key rights that we have under the ADA. And I'm going to start by talking about some aspects of accessibility that I think at this point, some of us don't even realize that these are civil rights that we are enjoying and that are part of our world now. And kind of thinking about how we've created spaces and parking lots and sidewalks and doctor's offices in ways to meet the needs of more people. And then we're going to talk about accommodations, which is another really important part of the ADA. So for accessibility, I've got on this slide accessible parking. And so the ADA is what mandates that we have accessible parking spaces when there's a parking lot. And so there's two images on the slide, and one is of an accessible parking space, and it just has the logo that typically shows this is an accessible space. And then there's an overhead shot of a giant parking lot with a gazillion cars in it. And so the idea again is, right, this is an anti-discrimination law. It's about equal opportunity. And so when we have a giant parking lot like this, it isn't an equal opportunity. It's a form of discrimination if we don't designate parking spaces that are closer to the entrance so that people who have mobility disabilities, chronic illnesses, all kinds of disabilities really can be closer to the entrance, right? And that's a form of providing equal opportunity to designate accessible parking spaces near an entrance. And the ADA has specific requirements about how many spaces need to be accessible in each lot. And it's based on kind of the total number of spaces in a parking lot. It's also, there's some differences for depending on if we're talking about a healthcare facility or a public space that's not related to healthcare. So there are very specific rules about the number of spaces, about how wide they need to be, where they're located. And those are all forms of civil rights, of equal access and opportunity. Another way that the ADA has changed our environment to make it more accessible for people with disabilities, and in a way that has benefited everyone, is by requiring what we call accessible routes. And so when you park at the grocery store or you get off the bus at the grocery store, right, there needs to be a route that's accessible, that's wide enough, that has a ramp, not steps, but not too steep of a ramp, and that leads to an accessible entrance. And this benefits people who use mobility devices like wheelchairs or scooters, canes, and walkers. Can benefit people who are blind, who use white canes to navigate spaces. It benefits people who have service animals, right? Because sometimes we take up more space when we have a dog next to us. But this also benefits people who might be pushing shopping carts, people who are carrying bags on wheels, people pushing strollers. And then on this slide, so I've just got some different examples. These are actually from the Access Board, who creates these standards of what it means for a sidewalk to be accessible. And it looks a little bit like building code. So there's a graph of kind of how you might get from a bus stop to a building. And there's a diagram of a ramp leading into an accessible door. And then there's also a drawing of a hand pushing down on a door handle. I just think this is really an incredible thing, that the way we shape a door handle can be a form of discrimination. And it can be a form of access when we create doors that are easier to open for more people with different ways of moving their bodies and getting through space. That's a really cool thing about the ADA, that again, benefits people with disabilities, but it also benefits people who might be carrying a lot of grocery bags and need to push down the door handle with their elbow, right? And so the last part of accessibility spaces that I wanted to talk about is just that once we're in a building, there are also rules that make the space more accessible to more people. And so there's a diagram of a bathroom, and I just wanted to note the grab bars there, right? That grab bars really are an accessibility feature that can benefit so many people, right? And sometimes we take it for granted that those are there now in many spaces. I've also got just a little diagram from the Department of Justice, and it's of a doctor's office, an accessible exam room. And that diagram just shows a woman in a scooter, and she's moving through an accessible aisle, right? So when we have a doctor's office or a restaurant or the DMV, right, the ADA asks us to make sure that there's always enough space for people with disabilities who are using mobility devices to navigate, right? There needs to be a wide enough access aisle to get through a space. Okay, so now let's jump into accommodations. And so for me, as a person with diabetes and someone with a learning disability and mental health conditions, accommodations have benefited me at school and in employment. And here we're talking about, right, sometimes it's not just our physical spaces that exclude people, but it's assumptions that all children should sit cross-legged in the little circle, or all employees need to show up from 9 to 5 and not take a break when their blood sugar's low. Or that you're not allowed to bring food to the museum because that's the policy. But what about someone like me that always needs food with them, right? So we're making changes to our policies, practices, the way we typically do things to include people with disabilities. And so I want you to know that I'm going to call all of the rights we're talking about in this next section accommodations. And technically, there are different legal terms for if you ask for an accommodation at work or if you ask for an accommodation at the movie theater. But it's the same overall logic, no matter where you ask for a change to a policy for people to do things a little differently, to maybe have a bit more support than what's typically provided. Okay, so the ADA is a civil rights law. It applies in our public lives. So, like I said, we can ask for accommodations at work, at the movie theater. And so I've got on the slide just a couple of examples of areas where the ADA applies. So employment, healthcare, state and local government, so the DMV, or education, transportation and travel, and then hospitality and entertainment. And so I've also got on the slide just what's missing. And it's important to know that as a civil rights law, the ADA doesn't apply to our churches, and it doesn't apply to private homes. So private apartment complexes, private condos. It doesn't apply, to when we have friends over for dinner or a barbecue in our backyard. This is about our public lives. Oh, and that's great that someone just asked about churches. And so the ADA doesn't apply to churches, but our state building codes and some state regulations can apply to churches in ways that would require them to be accessible. But that's not part of the Americans with Disabilities Act because it's a civil rights law. So I've got a couple of different examples of accommodations, and then we'll get to resources. So on this slide, I'm going to share some accommodations that are common in the community when we're out and about in the world. And so got kind of a scenario and then what the accommodation might look like. And so here, a public museum does not allow food, but a person with diabetes has requested to bring snacks to manage their blood sugar, right? And so the accommodation would be for the museum to allow the person to bring in snacks. And I highlight that one because I'm diabetic, but also because accommodations can be that simple, right? We make a change to our policy to allow more people to access our services. So another example is a person with a mobility disability is looking to use an electric scooter at an amusement park to get around, even though the amusement park doesn't usually allow motorized devices, right? So maybe they typically don't allow people to bring scooters. But an accommodation, if it's needed because of someone's disability, would be to allow them to use their electric scooter in the amusement park. One of the most common or maybe publicized accommodations that we see out in public and at work and in different parts of our lives are service animals, right? So many places in the world, they have a policy that says no pets, right? But that can exclude people who use service animals for many different kinds of disabilities. And so the ADA says we've got to make a change to those policies, make an accommodation, an exception to allow someone to bring a service animal in. And so I just want to note kind of what a service animal is. And so these are dogs that are trained to perform a task directly related to someone's disability. And so those can be things like supporting someone's mobility. They can help with navigation. They can alert people to sounds, to smells, to possible allergens. They can alert diabetics to high or low blood sugar. They can alert people to seizures that might come on. For people with mental health conditions, service dogs can help prevent panic attacks. They can help calm people down by laying on top of someone or laying under them when they're having a panic attack. They can nudge people to let them know, ooh, it smells like you might be about to have a migraine or another kind of episode. They're pretty amazing. They can be trained to do so many different tasks. And it's important to know that it can be any breed or any size of dog, and they can go wherever the public can go. So they can go to a buffet at a restaurant. And this is a big point of confusion that there's no certification process for a service animal, and they're not required to wear a vest, right? People with disabilities can actually train their own dogs to do different tasks for their disabilities. Okay, got a few more examples in the healthcare context. And this is really important because access to healthcare is particularly important for people with disabilities, and we see a lot of barriers to healthcare. So one common accommodation is about allowing people to bring support people to appointments. So we saw this a lot in COVID times. A doctor's office generally doesn't let anyone but the patient attend appointments. But a patient with a disability needs a support person to help them fully understand the doctor's recommendations. Right? And so the accommodation would be to change its policy and allow someone to bring a support person if that's what they need. Similarly, this is another common accommodation people can ask for. A doctor's office typically gives people written information in small print, right? Those little PDFs, the handouts we get after an appointment, it's tiny print. And so someone with a vision disability, they could request larger print or an electronic copy if that's what they need to access the information. So that's an important part of the ADA, access to information and communication. And we have that right in healthcare, in employment, and in our community. And so on this slide, I wanted to highlight something that I don't think a lot of people are aware of still, that the ADA says that kind of when we go out to see a movie, we can request an assistive listening device at the movie theater. And that could have captions or a visual description that allows us, if we have a vision or a hearing disability, to access the movie. There are other types of devices and tools like this. We call them communication aids and tools that you can request at a movie theater, the doctor's office, the DMV, at school. And those are things like interpreters, ASL interpreters, note takers, accessible materials like large print, And captioning, like we have in Zoom right now, right? That captioning is a form of access, is a type of accommodation we can ask if we need it because of a disability. Okay, and so these are my last examples of accommodations, and these ones are at work. And I've just got some simple ones that are really common. But remember, this is a law that's individualized. And so what is it that because of your disability, you might need to do differently to participate in work? It can be really anything. We can be really creative. There are limitations to what we can ask for, but we can start thinking really creatively about how we would best access work. What do we need to do differently? So common one is different schedules, right? Maybe you have a different start time because of medication you take. Maybe you take different kinds of breaks because of a chronic illness. Accessible parking spaces. So you could request to have an assigned parking space close to the office door. You could ask for equipment that helps with the job. So one common example is asking for a chair or a stool if you're working in a position where people typically stand up. Sign language interpreters can be asked for at work, and then large print materials, right? So if with diabetes, for example, vision disabilities happen, and so you could ask for a larger print. You could ask for a different format if that's what you need because of a disability. And so now I just have kind of resources, and the main one is I want you to know that the way to enforce your rights is through complaints primarily. And so I've got on this slide just links to 2 primary complaint portals where people can go and file a complaint to say, I've experienced discrimination, Department of Justice, EEOC, investigate. That's kind of the start of enforcing the ADA. And last, I have 2 additional resources that I just want to highlight, and you'll have links to these with the slides. Centers for Independent Living are centers in each state that are housed, or sorry, it's not about housing, that are staffed by people with disabilities who are experts in finding resources and knowing how to get supports to stay in the community. So they're great disability advocates, and they know the local resources. Last, it's the National Disability Rights Network. And so this is a network of law firms in each state that are publicly funded to protect the rights of people with disabilities. And so those links will take you to pages where you can find your local resources. So this is my last slide. It's just, you can always also call us at the ADA centers and ask questions about your rights. And we can help you navigate to where to file a complaint or where to ask for advocacy assistance. So thank you all very much. And I think we've got time for a few questions, hopefully.
Katie, thank you so very much for such a thoughtful presentation. And before we jump into questions, I'm going to invite you to come back because it sounds like we need a part 2 of this conversation. So again, thank you. I'd like to kick us off, if you don't mind. You said something that was particularly interesting to me about unseen disabilities. Can I ask you to delve into that a little more? And then the part 2 of that, of my question is, do I have to disclose an unseen disability to my employer or to maybe my landlord?
Mm-hmm. Great question. And thank you so much. I'd love to come back. Yeah, so I think we actually kind of considered that the majority of disabilities under this law in particular, under the ADA, are invisible or not seen most of the time, right? And so lots of things like depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, autism, cancer, diabetes, epilepsy, many of our conditions, most of the time aren't visible. Sometimes they become visible, right? If someone might have an episode or someone might have a panic attack, you could see that kind of manifestation of the disability. But most of the time, you really can't tell who people with disabilities are and aren't. And that doesn't affect our protections under this law. So kind of whether or not your disability is visible or not, you are kind of protected if it meets that definition of, does it substantially impact a part of your daily life? And then disclosures, it's a really tough and kind of personal decision. And so in general, I would encourage people, if you're wondering, I have a condition and I need an accommodation at work. I'm wondering if I should disclose to ask for an accommodation. I really would encourage people to call and talk to their local ADA center, because we can kind of think through, what's your work environment like? Is this a time in your life when you can ask for an accommodation? And so typically at work, when you ask for an accommodation, you don't have to say your specific diagnosis. You just have to say, I have a health condition, I have a mental condition that's impacting my ability to concentrate at work, or it's impacting my ability to show up at a certain time. I need a different schedule. So you don't have to say a diagnosis, but you need to let your employer know that it's a health condition or a mental condition, and that's the reason you need an accommodation, kind of, as opposed to, I don't like my office chair because it's uncomfortable, but it's not a disability, and so I'm asking for a more comfortable chair. You have to at least say, I'm asking because of a health issue.
Okay, thank you for that language. And we have a question in the chat, and the question asks, how do you get your dog designated as a service animal?
Great question. So you don't. That's kind of a huge misconception, kind of in our whole country, that the ADA is specifically written so that we don't designate or certify our service animals, because they can be so expensive, and that it allows people with disabilities to train their own dogs to do tasks for them. It's also about equal access and opportunity. So most of us, when we go to the grocery store, we don't have to carry our medical records and show, hey, I deserve to be allowed to go to the store and get my groceries. And the idea is that if we're requesting people with disabilities to have certification or paperwork for their service animals, it'd be similar to that. It's an extra barrier that isn't equal. So as long as a dog is trained to do a task that is related to your disability, that counts as a service animal. And you don't register or certify it with the Department of Justice or any kind of government entity.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And in the interest of time, we are right at 1:59, and I want to respect your time and our audience. And we're going to have you back. And to our audience, if we didn't get to your question this afternoon, Katie has graciously agreed to answer your question, and then we will get her response to you. But before we leave, I want to just ask one question, something you said throughout this webinar. You spoke to the Social Security Administration. Can I ask you to please leave us with their role and how they might help individuals with disabilities leverage any benefits that they might be entitled to?
Great question. And so Social Security, that is more about if you have a disability that makes it so you can't work, you can get benefits through Social Security in terms of a kind of a income and financial benefits. And that's really kind of separate from the ADA that's saying, I can work, but I need an accommodation to work, or I can work, but it's because people keep discriminating against me, and that's why I don't have a job. Whereas Social Security, it's got a different definition of disability that's based on whether or not someone can work. But it is a really important part of our disability kind of rights system that protects people with disabilities who don't work and can't work. And in the disability world, we would say, and that is okay. That is part of the human experience.
Right.
It's just another part of diversity and variation. So
Thank you, Katie. That was a perfect segue. We always ask our guests to give us one takeaway. If you had your one takeaway, what would you like our audience to know about the ADA?
that this is a law that understands that we all are different. We move in different ways, think in different ways. And so the logic of this law is always about how do we change things to be more flexible, to allow more people to participate who might just be a little bit different. And that in the disability rights world, we really value that people move and act and think in so many different ways. But I guess as the director of the ADA Center, I really would encourage you, if you have questions about your rights, that it's a free confidential service. So we really do want to help people understand how the law can support them.
Thank you, Katie. Perfect summation of today's webinar. We hope you will consider joining us for part 2 of this conversation. What an awesome webinar. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. And we do look forward to seeing you sometime in the near future. To our audience, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. If you have any questions, please feel free to email us at NCPA, and we will get those to Katie, and she will answer them, and we'll get them out, get your responses to you. Thank you, and have a great afternoon, everyone.